All right, we're going to have a video here to compare Spartan and Athenian governments and societies. If we start with Sparta, we can look at Spartan values first of all. So we look at things that Spartans valued. Spartan values. We knew they valued courage, strength, and honor in war. So we know the Spartans were very warlike people, that everything was based on being a war society. From their education growing up as kids at age 7, they were training for the war or training for battle. They were training to survive the elements, steal food to survive, and be tough. They valued courage, going into war and fighting your enemy without fleeing, facing your enemy and not being afraid. If you retreated as a Spartan, it was worse than dying in battle. Mothers had a saying that said, "Come back with your shield or on it," meaning come back carrying your shield as a victor from battle or dead upon your shield. If you came back without a shield, that meant you dropped your shield and fled in battle, and that was a sign of a coward. So mothers would rather have their sons die bravely in battle than come back cowards. So they value courage, strength, becoming the strongest Spartan they can so they can defend it. And the idea of honor, right? Honoring your leaders, honoring your city state, knowing that when you're fighting next to the person, to your right is he would give his life for you, and you give a life for them. Same thing to the person on the left. So these are some of the Spartan values. They also value equality, we know, or at least equality among Spartans. So from what we read on the laws of Lycurgus, Spartans valued the idea that all Spartans were the same. Lycurgus, Spartans area. Lycurgus outlawed luxurious arts and gold and silver coins and made the coins iron, so they were worthless. He got rid of jewelry making and anything that was considered luxury. Made all the Spartans eat at common table, so they all ate the same foods, and there was no difference between someone having a lavish meal and someone scraping by. So they believed in the equality of all Spartans. Of course, it doesn't apply to the non-Spartans because they had slaves, they had helots, but they believed in the equality of all Spartans. They believed in tradition. They believe that they should look to the past, look at the way things have always been done in Sparta, and use that as a guide to how they should do things in the present and future. They look to Lycurgus, this mythical lawgiver who supposedly got the laws from the gods around 750 BC, and he came up with all these laws, and they should look back to those laws and how they were carried out, and always do things the same way. And we'll see that the way they have their government, they value tradition. And we know that they value simplicity. They don't like things like fancy clothing, fancy houses, even reading. They said you should know how to read and write, to do what you have to do to like study military manuals or do the minimal, but reading shouldn't be for entertainment or pleasure. That was unmanly, they thought. Simplicity, they believed in austerity. Austerity means plain living. So nothing fancy in their houses. You can have a chair. You don't need a big fancy chair. You can have, plates, but they don't have to be fancy plates. Same thing with clothing. Functional clothing, but not ornate clothing. So you shouldn't have anything that's, beyond its function. And there's another word. It's not really a value, but we can put a word up here called laconic. Spartans were known to be laconic, meaning a few words. This comes from the area of Sparta. The polis Sparta had its city proper part where the people lived, the Spartans lived, and then the farmland and countryside where the Helots worked, and that area was called Laconia. And this is where when the Dorians invaded and eventually evolved into the Spartans, this area of Laconia is where they settled. And we call it, with its word laconic comes from that because it means a few words, someone that speaks very little. So the Spartans were known to be a few words. They wouldn't sit around and talk for the sake of talking or gossip or say, to fill time, talk about the weather or whatever it might be. They said what had to be said and that was it. So these are some Spartan values that we have. So if we think about how these are put in place in their government and society, the Spartans had one body of government called the assembly. And the assembly was made up of all Spartan men over the age of 20. So think about 20 years old is when you complete your military training, or where they completed their military training. They were men at that point, and then they became part of government. They would have some purpose. So in the assembly, it says all Spartan men over the age of 20, they could propose laws, they could propose war, they could propose treaties, And the key part of this is propose, right? They can't make laws. They can't, declare war or formalize treaties. They can suggest them. So in this government body, then the assembly, it's part of the legislative process, but they don't have final say over any laws. And it's interesting that the way that they would work would be, the way that this system would work was that, as far as who could talk, the oldest and most highest ranking Spartan spoke first. So that might be like a general in the army, and he might get up and say we were going to propose a law that would change the way Sparta was, allow something that Spartans didn't necessarily like before. He would get up and say, I think this is a bad idea. We shouldn't propose this law because it's changing the way Sparta is. And then the next highest ranking person in the army, an oldest person, probably another general, would get up and say, and these generals that were in charge were also probably the kings at most points. So they would get up and, the second guy might get up and say, I think this is a bad idea. We shouldn't do this. It would go on down the line until by the time you got to the younger Spartans, almost all the important people have already spoken. So think about this with this idea of going back to tradition, right? They value tradition. Older people generally tend to be less prone to change. They don't want to have newfangled ways and things like that. So if the oldest and most highest ranking people have already spoken, they're probably going to speak out against any laws that would propose change or any treaties that would imply change or anything like that. They'd always say, well, how has Sparta always done it? That's how we should do it. And as they would go down, we're talking thousands of people at the assembly potentially. They're speaking out about these things. If you're one of the younger Spartans and you're 25 years old and you're in their army, but you're one of the lower ranks, and your general has already said he hates the law, the idea, and maybe like what we were like, like our ranks in the army today, like maybe there'd be like a sergeant or a captain that would say that. These are all people that you have to answer to every day in the military world. If they've all said they hate a law and they don't want to change, you have incredible pressure upon you to say, no, I don't really think we should change the law either or propose a change because that would make me look bad to my general. Maybe, I'd get extra like push-ups or, physical, training or abuse in the field or something like that if they thought I wasn't supporting them. So just by the very nature of how they voted, the assembly then didn't promote change. But let's say for some reason they had proposed change, the law approving board was called the Council of Elders. And the Council of Elders was all Spartan men over the age of 60. And you might think in the world of Sparta, without medicine and hospitals and things like that, there probably weren't too many people over 60, but there was actually a decent amount of them. When we think of life expectancy, it was probably like in the mid 30s, maybe high 30s, but that's a take into account that like 50% of babies died before they were one because of, just the problems of being, an infant. So that kind of always throws the average off. But if you can make it past 30 years old, you had a pretty good chance of living for, a decent amount of time. So either way, though, the Council of Elders here is all Spartans over the age of 60. And this council, maybe I should erase that bottom line here. This council, their job was to, approve or reject laws. So if you were in the assembly and you were able to convince people to propose a law that that was going to support change, it would then come down to these council of elders, all these Spartan men over the age of 60, and they would either approve or reject it. And again, them being older are going to want to do things the way they always were. Back in my day, when things were better, the good old days, they're not going to want to see a lot of change. So ultimately, it's very unlikely that a law, even if it got approved by the assembly or proposed by the assembly, they would probably get rejected by the Council of Elders if it called for any kind of extreme changes in law. Other parts of the government, so these are our legislative bodies, and then we could look at the other branches in a sense, not really branches like we have today, but they had two kings. And these two kings were probably descendants of some of the first people living in Sparta, some of the strongest historians. They were kings and generals. One king always served out in the field with the army. One king always stayed home at Sparta to oversee the government, and they would change places from time to time. The reason being, you don't want both kings out in the field training with the army or fighting, because if they both die, then you have a government problem, without any king. So there's always one king back at home. So they served as in a sense, the chief executives. They would oversee that laws passed by the Council of Elders were carried out. And then you had the ephors. The ephors, there were five of them, and they were considered the overseers of the system. They were usually the five oldest, wisest Spartans, the most respected of the Spartans, and they had, in a sense, power over the rest of the system. So even if a law were to, get passed by the assembly over here, and then the council, or there were a law got proposed by the assembly, and then the council of elders were to approve of it, even if they pass a law, the five ephors over here could say, nope, we reject it. It's not the way Sparta's always done things, and we're going to reject it. So they had ultimate, in a sense, veto power over the rest of the system. So, again, very unlikely things are going to get changed in a system like this when you have the oldest, most traditional people in charge of all these things. The last group that we could put on here is the Crypteia. And the Crypteia was essentially, this is the secret police. So usually when young Spartan men finished their training at the age of 20, some of them were recruited into the Crypteia. And in the Crypteia, they would, in a sense, spy on this. First of all, the Helots, right? They would look at the Helots and make sure that they weren't uprising, because that was a problem Sparta always had to worry about, was Helot uprisings. But if beyond just watching the Helots, they would also spy on each other. So if there was any Spartans walking around talking about un-Spartan-like things, or suggesting changes, or maybe criticizing the ephors, they would be ratted out by the Crypteia and then punished accordingly by probably their commanders in the military. And everyone, what's genius about this, in a sense, if you can think of genius as far as it's kind of evil, not evil, but it's bad. The Crypteia is that everyone knew that anybody that coming out of the army, out of the training, could be part of the Crypteia, but they didn't know who they were, but they knew they were out there. So let's say you were prone to complain about the system. You didn't know who was in the secret police and who wasn't, but you knew that some of them were in the secret police. So someone that's your best friend, you might want to confide and say, oh, I think the E4s are wrong, or Sparta's doing the wrong thing. But your friend could be part of the Crypteia, and then you could be reported and then, be punished for it. So, this system here was, the Crypteia was designed to stop people from even wanting to complain, or even trying to complain. So we have our government Spartan value, or here's our Spartan values up here. And this is our government of Sparta. Should label that government of Sparta. Last thing we can look at is Spartan society. And at the top of Spartan society was the first group of people called the equals. Their word for it was the homoioi, meaning all the same. And we know that equals were people that were had two Spartan parents, so they were full-blooded Spartans, which means they were descended of the Dorians. And the men trained in the military and could serve in government. Women did not serve in government. They had no political rights, but they could enjoy rights that other Greeks didn't, such as inheriting property, in a sense, running the family, whatever the family, if there was a business of sorts, that whatever that was, the women would run that, because the husbands were constantly out fighting. They were 20, they could marry, but they couldn't live at home until they were 30. And even after they're 30, they still ate in common with the other Spartans. So women were very much independent on their own. Women were encouraged to be, healthy and exercise, because they had to be strong so they could have lots of children, because the Sparta needs soldiers for the army. So this first group of the society, this first social class, you might say, is equals, full-blooded Spartans. Below them were what we can call half citizens, this is where our book refers to it. And the word for they used was peroi koi. Basically, what these half citizens did is they were artisans, they were craftsmen, people that had a skill that the Spartans needed it but didn't either possess, or they didn't want to dedicate time to mastering. And these were people that were free, but not citizens. So they couldn't vote, they couldn't have any say in the government. They had some rights, like they couldn't be enslaved or or just killed or anything like that. So they were free. They lived amongst them, and they provided some service that the Spartans didn't provide for themselves. And maybe that could be like, maybe a metalsmith, because the Spartans didn't want to dedicate time to learning how to craft metal because they were fighting. So they wanted someone, make the swords for them, or like someone that like a leather worker or tanner that might make like the sandals they wore, or like parts of the uniform or whatever it might be. So these half citizens were people that had skills that were not part of Spartan society, or not, sorry, not part of Spartan government, but they were free to live amongst them. And there was a lot less of them than there were equals. And then at the bottom are the Helots, and these are, put that word up here, state slaves. So they're slaves, but not like when we see in Athens, slaves belong to individual Athenians often. We see that in Rome, in America, and before the Civil War, slaves were property of individual owners. In Sparta, slaves were state slaves. They're owned by Sparta in general. Spartan had this very strong idea of Sparta comes first. You always put Sparta before the individual. So helots were people that did the farm work for the Spartans. So they grew the food because Spartans, again, they're not going to waste time farming because they're constantly training for fighting. So these are the people that provided the food for the Spartans. And the problem with the Helots is that they outnumbered the Spartans. Just make their circle a little bit bigger, right? They outnumbered the Spartans. So that's a problem when you live in a society, when you oppress a group of people to force them to do your labor and take away their freedoms, and then they outnumber you because they could always try to rise up and overthrow you. So that's why groups like we have over here, the Cryptea here, they were in charge of watching and guarding the Helots, trying to catch wind of any uprisings and crushing them before they turn into anything. And that's another reason why when we study the wars of the Greeks, the Spartans weren't terribly concerned. Once Persia was defeated, they didn't want to make some big defensive alliance because they had to bring the soldiers back home to watch over the Helots. So that's Spartan society. And there's some similarities and differences that we'll see with Athens. If we move on to Athens, let's I guess we can leave, no, we'll erase that. If we look on to Athens, we can think about Athens, Athenian government. When we think of Athenian government, it's important to think about, this is an evolution of democracy. So sometimes you might get the idea of, Athens started democracy. They all sat down, came up with a plan, and put it in place, kind of like the founding fathers did in America in the Constitutional Convention. They all went to Philadelphia and they sat down. They didn't leave until they had a constitution. Not so with Athens. Really, what happens with Athens is that they have crises, and then they solve the crises, they make some reforms, and then years later they have other crises, they make some reforms, and eventually, after about 150 years, they evolve into what turns out to be democracy. If we think about where they started with a monarchy, and with the monarchy were nobles. So this is our first stage of Athenian government, and the monarchs evolved from the early people that went to Athens. They're from the original clan that was there. Eventually turned into a tribe as they intermarried their families with other clans to gain strength. And the monarchs evolved from the strongest and most powerful of the warrior chiefs, and eventually became monarchs or kings of Athens. And they ruled with the help of the nobles, who were the first people there. This is something that a word we have, eupatrids. Think of nobles. This literally means well-fathered ones. Meaning they came from these families with the right parents, well-fathered ones. So when we look back at Athens, who were the first people there? Who were the people that first settled it? There were a small group of families. These eupatrids were all people that came from those families. They pass it down through their bloodline from father to son. And hundreds of years later, there's this elite group of people called the eupatrids who have all the power and privileges. In this monarchy, you had the kings that had executive power, and the nobles who had legislative power and what they called the areopagus or areopagus. It's supposed to be an O here. Right, the Areopagus. And what the Areopagus was a council that could make laws, declare war, or form treaties. Areopagus literally means the hill of Ares, and if you know from Greek mythology, Ares is the god of war. So this is the first Areopagus council met to decide whether they should go to war, and eventually they make laws, declare war, and make treaties, and they also oversee legal systems. In a sense, it's the court. So this is our first government of Athens. It's controlled by very few people. And you think about these monarchs are also eupatrids, so they serve in the Areopagus too. So there's no real separation of powers. The two monarchs might have people, like in a sense, people that work for them that help carry out things. But if the Areopagus made laws, the monarchs would make sure they got carried out. So we have a very limited government there at the very beginning. Eventually, we end up with what we call an aristocracy. And from the reading, this means ruled by the elite. And the way the aristocracy comes about is that eventually these eupatriots, these well-fathered ones, want more power than the king's willing to give them. So, and it kind of comes from the idea. I'll put a picture in here of this is what we call a hoplite. So if we look at this picture of a soldier, this is let's write the word hoplite up here. This is a Greek soldier. So it's an Athenian hoplite. And you look at what this hoplite's wearing. They got a shield for both protection and and for fighting. They use as an offensive weapon often to crush your enemy. But that's something that somebody has to make. That's made out of wood and bronze and has leather straps on it. They got the hoplite helmet to protect their heads. That's custom fitted to each person, so it's nice and tight. It's not wobbling around. They got this very ornate breastplate that was made with all for intimidation factors. It looked like the muscles of the body lined with felt on the inside. This is very expensive to make. They got these metal greaves, these shin guards to protect their legs, and then the things like the spears and the swords. All this stuff you think about, weapons in the army. This all adds up to a lot of money. So who can afford to be a hoplite? And originally the hoplites are the aristocrats, the nobles. We better place. We'll call that nobles here, so we don't confuse it with the form of government. The nobles, right? These eupatriots. It took a lot of money to be a hoplite. The average person couldn't afford all this stuff, and they also couldn't spend time training for this. These hoplites would fight in a battle formation called the phalanx. So here's a picture of a phalanx, and that's in the book too. If you think about it, I'll make that a little bit bigger so we can see it and overlap it. A phalanx is soldiers fighting in a formation. And in this case, you look at it, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 soldiers this way, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 soldiers this way. So this is 80 soldiers fighting, 80 hoplites fighting in a formation. This takes a lot of training. Imagine if you're fighting and everyone has to move. They say, we're being attacked, move this way. Everybody has to be able to order and shuffle this way without crushing the people in the front or trampling the people in the middle. If the people over in the back here are moving faster than the people in the middle, then they might get crushed. And this takes a lot of coordination and training. So to be a hoplite fighting in a phalanx, then this is not something that you can just jump in and do. You have to actually have some training for that and money. So how this relates to government is, since the aristocrats, these nobles, these eupatriots made the hoplites, they're saying, look, we're doing most of the defense. Granted, the kings also wear armor and fight, but really the king can't get along without the eupatriots, but the eupatriots couldn't get along without the kings. And the aristocrats, these eupatriots, wanted to have government for themselves. So in this aristocracy, what they end up doing is abolishing the kings, and they rule just with the Areopagus, right? So the Areopagus becomes the only functioning body, the only lawmaking body that there is, and they would elect people called, let's let me go to another page here. Let's map this out. So we got rid of the kings. Now we still have the Areopagus, which is the aristocratic body that is making the laws, and they would elect, instead of kings, people called archons, who would be the magistrates. This is a word that we'll see come up several times with Greece and Rome. Magistrates, basically government officials. And the archons, and they varied how many. Sometimes there was 5, sometimes there was 9. They would carry out the will of the Areopagus, right? So the Areopagus would still make the laws. They would declare war and make treaties. And instead of the kings overseeing it, these archons over here would. And the Areopagus elected the archons. And if the archons weren't people that are already eupatrids, after the archons served their 1 year term, they would then go and join the Areopagus. So it's kind of still a very closed elite system of the eupatrids, everyone looking out for each other. During this time of aristocracy, we have aristocratic reform. Aristocratic reform. So there's going to be the people of Athens are not going to always be content with this. We're talking the non-eupatrids, right? You have the nobles, but then you have all the common people. Some of them could be poor farmers, but some of them could be merchants that aren't aristocratic, people that bring in a lot of trade to Athens, make a lot of money, artisans and craftsmen who have skills. So we have some reform movements in 621 BC. And in class, don't worry about, you're not going to have to memorize most dates. There might be some real pivotal dates that we talk about, like, think in American history, 1776. We should all know 1776, the Declaration of Independence. We'll come across a few of those for the year, but in this case, I'm going to put out the dates just to give you a sense of time and how long this takes for this to evolve. In 621, an aristocratic eupatrid gets elected archon, a guy named Draco, and he comes up with Draco's laws. What's important about Draco's laws is they were the first written laws of Athens. Before this, laws weren't written down. The Areopagus was the keeper of the courts and the laws. And if you were a commoner and you say you were accused of a crime and you wanted to go to defend yourself, you had no idea what the law was or what the law wasn't. A system like that is ripe for abuse. It's passed down through oral tradition. Eupatrids in the Areopagus could make things up, or they could interpret them differently. So you never really knew if you were getting a fair shake of the laws. But Draco says we're going to have the first written set of laws. They would be published, written in stone. They would be put in the Agora of Athens, so everybody could see them in a public place. And they were severe and they were harsh. Things like stealing, having your hand cut out, eyes gouged out, death penalty for a lot of things. And it wasn't equal in any way. So eupatrids had better deals than commoners. So, for instance, if you were a eupatrid and you struck a commoner, you would pay a fine for hitting them. But if a commoner struck a eupatrid, there was a physical punishment. I believe it was either the hands getting cut off or it might have even been death. But either way, the punishment was much different. If you were a higher social class, you got a better easier punishment than a poor person. So it's not fair, and they're very harsh, but it is a written set of laws. At least you knew what they were. You knew if you were violating the laws. So, the crisis, I talked about how there's going to be these periods of crisis and reform. The crisis was that the people of Athens were getting tired of not getting a fair shake in the court. They demanded written laws, and Draco delivers them. The next aristocrat that comes along around 594 BC is Solon. And you read a little bit about him. There's a little extra reading on Solon. Solon was from a eupatrid family. He was from a noble family, but his father had squandered their wealth, so he became a merchant. So he was both a noble, but he also was kind of like a self-made man at the same time who became wealthy. So in the end, Solon's he's liked by everybody. He's also not trusted by everybody. He's got kind of a foot in both camps, nobility and commoners. So Solon says, look, we got to make some reforms. And a great problem at this time was debt slavery. That if you were a farmer, then you borrowed money, say, like, imagine if you're a poor farmer and you didn't have enough money to grow your crops and plant your crops, and you need the tools and all that stuff. You might need maybe an animal like a mule to carry things. You might go to a eupatrid who had some money and borrow money from them, and say, in a year I'll pay you back $1,000. So the eupatrid might say, okay, I'll give you $1,000, but I want, say, $1,100 back in a year, some interest for it. And maybe the farmer's okay with that because he anticipates making $2,000 off of his crop. But there were times, much like we're going through now, with severe weather and drought, and crops don't grow. So if you borrowed $1,000 and you have to pay back $1,100 and you have no crop to sell because of a drought conditions, then all of a sudden you're in debt for $1,100. So you might ask for another year, maybe they give it to you. But if you have a couple years like that in a row, all of a sudden you find yourself in massive debt. And with the laws of Athens at the time, I noticed this is BC. The laws of Athens at the time said that if you owed money, an aristocrat could demand you to be their slave, or they could demand your family to be their slave. So a lot of people had obviously big problems with that, and they were, it was unfair and unjust. And if you're indebted to someone and you're a slave for them for 10 years and you're not growing your own food, you're not, helping your family. So this is a terribly predatory system. So Solon comes in, he says, look, we got to, we got to end debt slavery. He cancels most of the debt, not all the debt, but most of the debt, and he ends debt slavery. And then he also takes things like he passes Solon's laws, or I shouldn't say he passes them, but he works to have Solon's laws passed. And you read about some examples of those. Some of them were just more lenient laws and Draco's laws, so they weren't as severe. They changed marriage that, wasn't so skewed towards the rich. They made things just more fair. So Solon's laws were passed, which were a little bit more for the people. The other thing Solon does is he carries the Council of 400. What the Council of 400 is important because if we look over here, I'll do a diagram. Social classes were before that eupatrids and commoners. And in that commoners, there could be people that were wealthy like merchants, and there could be people that were poor like farmers. So what Solon does, he says, we're going to make 4 social classes. So they're going to be, number them 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they'll be based on wealth. So it's a Solon system. In this system, anybody in these first 2 social classes, based on wealth, so the richest up here and the second richest here, they could serve in the Council of 500, and they could vote in what they call the assembly, right? So they have people that are going to vote in the assembly. So the Council of 400 is going to carry out laws of the assembly. So it still leaves, 2 groups down here unrepresented in government, but Solon didn't feel that these people, the poorest groups, were really ready for self-government. So he thought that, leave it to these first 2 groups. What's important about this, though, is that this creates social mobility, because you think if you're a poor person, since social class is now based on wealth, if you're a poor person, you can move up the ladder by working hard or being a merchant or whatever it might be. But also, if you don't work hard and you're lazy, you can move down in the system, right? So this created incentive for people to want to work harder and have a living. That's much different than this system over here, right? Because if you are a eupatrid, it's because you were born into it. If you're a commoner, there's no way if you can get up to there, right? There's, it's like there's a barrier there you can't break through because you're not born into one of these families. So this system over here is bad. Solon's system over here allowed social mobility. People could move up and down through society. So he also reforms juries to be juries of peers. Right. So instead of nobles sitting at your in judgment of you, the juries would be made up of other Athenians. So these are some of our aristocratic reforms. There's a brief. You go to the next thing here. We'll look at. There's a brief period of tyranny in Athens. Tyranny. I'll fix that. Tyranny. Here we go. And that was brought on by a guy named Pisistratus. This is roughly around 560 BC. So we get this guy Pisistratus and his sons who rule as a tyrant. You read in the reading that he faked being wounded. He came in, had a group of soldiers bodyguard him, and eventually he takes control by force, takes control of Athens. In a sense, with the military coup. The army supports him. And he ruled with absolute power. Now, he doesn't get rid of the Council of 400. He doesn't get rid of the assembly. He doesn't get rid of the juries. Although it doesn't get rid of Solon's laws. All those things stay in place, but really his will becomes what what Athens does. However, he ruled for the good of the people. So we think of a tyrant like Kim Jong-un of North Korea or Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union during and after World War II. We think of them as being bad people. Pisistratus was a tyrant who ruled for the good of the people. He wanted to put in reforms for everybody in Athens. So, we may not like the way he did it, but at least the evidence seems to support that he did a lot of good things for a lot of people. He also did some bad things. Some of the things that he did was that he redistributed land. Redistributed farmland to poor. This is both good and bad depending on how you look at it. If you were a poor person, this is great because you didn't have any land and the land was controlled by the Eupatriid families. They had sometimes land in excess, so you got land. And the reason that Pisistratus wanted to do this was that he felt that if you own land, it would get these poor people to be more loyal, more patriotic, more part of what Athens was. They would just feel like these people on the outskirts. Of course, to get the land, they took it away from nobles, the Eupatrids. So who doesn't like this, of course, is the Eupatrids, because they say, "Well, that land's been in our family forever." And I think this is kind of like you might make an analogy to redistributing wealth, right? If we were going to say, well, we want to help the poor over here, we're going to take land from the rich. If this is the poor, we're going to take land from the rich or money from the rich and give it to the poor. So this might be the rich. When we have a tax that takes money from the rich and gives it to the poor, then that's a redistribution of wealth. That's kind of what Pisistratus does when he says we're going to take land away from the Eupatrids and give it to the poor. So good for the poor. Eupatrids didn't like it so much. If the Eupatrids were totally obstinate or wouldn't go along with it, he would exile them. So he exiled nobles and political opponents. So anybody who spoke out against him was exiled, got kicked out of Athens. So most Eupatrids went along with it, even though they didn't like it. Another thing he did is he created a great public works program. He wanted to beautify Athens. So build the first aqueduct that brought fresh water to fountains. Beautify. Bring fresh water to Athens. He built aqueducts. He built temples. He built public buildings, fixed the roads. Did lots of stuff. You think about this, to beautify Athens has one purpose. It makes them proud to be in Athens. If their city looks beautiful, then they feel, like they're part of something great. It also created jobs for poor. So people that were unemployed looking for work, all of a sudden they had jobs. The government was going to give them money to work on these beautiful projects. It wasn't great work. They're hauling marble and big chunks of rock around without modern equipment. So this is not great work, but it was work. So he created a public works program. And you think that was to beautify Athens? You might even think help stimulate the economy by giving jobs to the poor. The last thing he did is he made public festivals free. And you think about why that's important. People before that, if you want to go see a play in the theater or some kind of public performance, then it would cost money. If you were poor, you weren't going to blow money to go see the Iliad being performed in a play. You think about, this is like today. This is like if you want to go to a Red Sox game, you're probably forking over hundreds of dollars to go to see the Red Sox between the tickets, the overpriced food, the parking, all the different stuff that go in there. You can go to see a Red Sox game and easily find yourself $400 or $500 in the hole. After seeing a game. So you think about Red Sox games, it's not for the poor people, right? It's very tough for a poor person to go see a Red Sox game. So they don't really feel part of like that great Boston tradition. Well, similarly with this, free public festivals would help boost patriotism. That the poor could now see these things and be part of the Athenian culture, just like the rich were. So this will help boost patriotism. So this is the tyranny, and Pisistratus ruled, as did his sons after that. But eventually he was overthrown by our last person. We'll look at democracy in Athens around 504 BC. A guy named Cleisthenes comes in, an aristocrat, a noble, who wants to turn government over to the people, or we might say the demos, right? The Greek word for people, where we get democracy, government of the people. People. Turn government over to the people. And the way that he comes in to reform that is he says, what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, we're going to reorganize the way that we decide who goes and serves in government. Reorganize tribes of Athens. So he creates 10 different tribes made up of people from all parts of the Athenian city. So if you imagine, let's draw like a little rough picture of a city, and there's different parts of it. Let's just simplify this. There's 4 parts of the city. We'll call it the farms. We'll call this the port area. We'll call this the mountains. We'll call this the city center. So this is I'm just kind of making this up a little bit. This is relatively close to how they'd be in Athens, but like these aren't necessarily exactly how it would go. But for the sake of illustrating this, we might say, look, we're going to take say 10 people from the mountains, 10 people from the city, 10 people from the port, oops, and 10 people from the farms. And that's going to be one tribe. I'm simplifying the numbers here. Obviously it's more than 10. And then we're going to take, do the same thing. We're going to create another tribe, and it's going to be 10 from the mountains, 10 from the city, 10 from the farms, 10 from the port. And we're going to make a third, the third tribe that's going to be the same thing. 10 from the mountains, 10 from the city, 10 from the farms, 10 from the port. And we're going to keep going, to simplify this. But what we have here is, instead of about people living in the farms over here, they have things in common, right? They're probably the same social class. They work hard for a living, and they all think like-mindedly. And they might sometimes think it's us versus those wealthy patrons in the city center, or it's us versus those wealthy merchants in the port. And similarly with the groups. So what Cleisthenes has done is he said, look, we're going to get people from, in this say this example here, right? We're going to have 10 people from each of these different areas, and they're going to now have to talk to people from the other areas that they maybe didn't talk to before. They're going to have to learn to work together as a tribe and communicate, and then select people from these tribes to go and serve in the Council of 500. So what he's done is he's basically made people no longer loyal to their specific areas, like the mountains and the farms and all the other stuff. And now they're loyal to Athens over that. These regional identities, or these regional bias they had before, are going to be gone. So he organizes the tribes. And then he has them serve in the Council of 500. So let's erase this little example here. So then he creates the Council of 500, takes the Council of 400, bumps it up to 500 to represent the 5 tribes. And this council would have 1-year terms. So if you serve in one person, or I shouldn't say one person, several people from each tribe would serve in the Council of 500 every year. They'd have 1-year terms. They would be chosen by random lot, which is kind of a strange way to select. You think a random lot, it'll be like saying one person from each town is going to randomly be selected to go serve in Congress every year. It's great in some ways because anybody can serve in Congress, so you don't have to have wealth or connections to do it. But it's also bad because you could have apathetic people, you could have, evil people, you could have just not qualified people that they're serving. So it's kind of good and kind of bad. The idea of random law was that anybody could serve. It's everybody's job to serve in government. And that the function of the Council of 500 would be to propose laws, war, and treaties. So they've taken some of the functions, if you remember, from the Areopagus and given it to the Council of 500. The other part of the government would be the assembly, which is going to be similar to what Solon did. This will be all adult male Athenians. So you have to, similar to Sparta, right? So we know that in Sparta you had to be full Spartans. In Athens, to serve in the assembly, you had to be full-blooded Athenian. Both parents were Athenian, and you had to be a man. So this excludes women. We think about Athens being a great place of democracy, but they excluded women. Women have very little rights in Athens. So all adult males would serve. And what they would do is they'd probably meet several times a year, probably it varied from year to year, but they would meet, it could be up to once a month. And this would be all Athenian men. So this could be 6,000 to 7,000 men meeting in the assembly at any given time. And their job was to pass, reject laws. And this would be characterized by vigorous debate. So they would pass or reject laws. They would debate it. Everybody, any of this group of people, right? So we have the Athenians. All 6,000 or 7,000, however many men were there at the time, 6,000 or 7,000 people, if they wanted to talk about a law, so we're going to pass a law to provide public education. In theory, if all 6,000 people that were there wanted to talk, they had to be allowed to speak before they could vote or reject a law. And they were timed with a water clock, and they could get I'm not sure exactly how many minutes they got, but let's say 5 minutes. I mean, this could go on for days debating a law, because if you If you wanted to talk, you had to be allowed to talk. And similar to Athens, I mean Sparta too, they allowed people to talk in order of their age and where they were in society and their military rank. So a similar kind of thing. The younger you were, probably the less influential your voice was, but you could speak if you wanted to. So all the assembly, all adult men served. The Greeks had, interestingly enough, a word for people that didn't want to serve in government called idiot. Although I think in the Greek there was an e at the end. I'll have to refresh my memory to the Greek. But basically, an idiot was, unlike today's terms, someone that think of someone that's not that intelligent. Their word idiot meant someone that they in a sense shunned their political duty. They didn't show up to the assembly to vote and debate, or they didn't serve in the Council of 500 when they were chosen by random lot. They took this very seriously, serving in government, that it was really their civic duty to do so. The last part of this we could look, well, two more parts of this we could put up here, is that they kept the Areopagus. This became a court for capital offenses. So very limited, right? So instead of hearing all cases, the Areopagus became a court just for hearing capital offenses. So cases that would warrant death. So, what that was then, I'm not 100% sure, but, murder or things like that. So they kept the Areopagus, but then you guys have him here. They continued jury of peers. Change that. Jury of peers, just like with Solon, chosen by a random lot. So you could be asked at any time to serve on a jury to decide the fate of whoever's being convicted of something. The last part of this that Cleisthenes puts in, I think, is interesting, called ostracism. What ostracism basically is that someone could be exiled from Athens for 10 years. Athens for 10 years. Now, this is really interesting because the reason that they had this is they said, look, if we're going to have all the common people, right? We've now gone to this idea that anybody can vote up here at the assembly, right? So up here in the assembly, anybody can vote, all adult males. And that means that you might have some people that aren't super qualified or maybe not educated, and they had a fear that with all these common people voting, they could be led astray by a type of person that would be a demagogue. If you think about what this means, dema, of the people, gog meaning leader, kind of like a pedagogue is a leader of a child, a demagogue, leader of the people. But this had a negative connotation, and it does still today in politics. A demagogue is someone that is a leader of the people, but they lead them astray. They might use their power of persuasion and rhetoric to convince people to do things that weren't good for the city-state, but might give the demagogue power or influence. They would lead the people astray to do bad things. You think about in modern history, you may have studied last year, Hitler is a demagogue, right? Someone that was democratically elected, used the democratic processes of the German Republic to become the leader, and then eventually slowly took away the rights of the people and became the dictator that he was. He was a demagogue. He used propaganda and lies and mass media to convince people of doing things. So anyway, this idea of the demagogue goes back to ostracism, because they feared, what if somebody does this? What if we have a demagogue and they were a threat to Athens? So once a year, they would vote on who the biggest threat to Athens was, and they would kick them out of Athens for 10 years. So, if you were the kind of person that might use your persuasive skills or rhetoric to try to convince people to give you power, you could find your name written on what they called an ostracon, which was a post that was put in the agora of Athens. It had a list of all the people exiled, and you could find yourself kicked out of Athens for 10 years. So pretty harsh treatment for someone that tried to abuse that power. So if we just finish up here, we can look at the timeline here. And I said, remember, dates aren't super important, but we started with 621 BC with our first big reform of Draco. And then we ended up with, the 590s with Solon making his reforms, the 560s with tyrant Pisistratus making some reforms for the people, and then eventually with Cleisthenes, who brings in direct democracy. and that's in 504 BC. So think about this. The reason I put this up here is just the idea that we're looking at what about 100, we'll say about 120 years, rounding a little bit, right? 120 years of this evolution of Athenian democracy. And again, sometimes, we had this idea in our heads that Athens created democracy and it was all like, boom, they had a plan, they marched towards it and come up with democracy. But really is a slow process of there's a crisis and they solve it and they end up good. And there's a crisis and they solve it and they end up good. And there's a crisis and they solve it and they end up good. So have these ups and downs. Last thing we'll talk about in this video is just the make their comparison to Sparta, complete Athenian society. So at the top of Athenian society was all natural born. I shouldn't say natural born. I'll say, let me fix that. All full blooded Athenian people. So we know that men had more rights than women, but women were considered citizens at the top of that society socially. So if they were full-blooded, right, they had a mother and a father, both Athenians. This is our top of our society, our top social class. Below them were the people we saw in Sparta. We call them, the book calls them half-citizens, and the word was proikoi. They were called medics in Athens. And very similar to Sparta, these were artisans, craftsmen, which I guess actually is the same thing as an artisan, merchants. So people that did things that Athenians didn't have. Merchants that brought stuff in from exotic places that Athenians wanted stuff from. Artisans that did jobs that Athenians didn't have the skills for. So these were people that were very much like we think about the half citizens in Sparta. They were free, but had no political rights. They couldn't partake in the process. And Athens also had slaves. Much less than Sparta as far as total number, but they were individually owned. For the most part, some of them weren't, but most of them were individually owned. So they might be prisoners of war, some that owed money, whatever it might be, although they outlawed debt slavery eventually. But whatever circumstances, by the time Athens reached its height of democracy, then they're probably more likely prisoners of war, individually owned. So they would belong, in a sense, to individual Athenians. A little bit different than even we think of slavery in the United States. Most slaves could work their way to freedom. They were given some rights. They weren't treated completely like property. For example, you read about in the book, some slaves became the pedagogues of, there's a word for you from the book, pedagogues, right? The leader of children. They would kind of, in a sense, watch over Athenian children, till they got to the point of going to school to teach them manners. The weird thing about slavery in Athens is that it's hypocritical, first of all, for democracy to exist with slavery, but also that Athenians saw slaves as crucial to democracy. We would think of it as like, hey, democracy and slavery are incompatible, but the Athenians thought that slavery allowed Athenians to participate in democracy. So if you're an Athenian and you want to dedicate your life to public service, and if you get called to be part of the Council of 500, you go and do that. And originally, we'll see later on, a guy named Pericles pays public citizens. But early on, this wasn't a paid job. So if you were chosen randomly to serve in the Council of 500, you were doing it, for free, and you weren't, maybe losing some time working on your farm or running your business, wherever you made a livelihood. You were losing time to do that, which meant losing money. So the Athenians really thought of slavery in a weird way. To at least it's weird to us today, that slavery was good for democracy. Democracy couldn't happen without slavery, because slavery freed up Athenians to participate in democracy, because the slaves could run things back at home while the Athenians participated. And the other big hypocritical thing about this course is that it excludes, medics have no say in government. We have slaves that have no say in government. The other group that's excluded that I mentioned briefly before was women, right? Women are kind of on the outsides over here. I mean, they're part of society, but they're part of this group up here with the full-blooded Athenians. They're technically up there, but they don't have any political rights. And you read from in the book, they had very little social rights. They had no legal rights. They couldn't inherit property. They had to walk behind their husband in public. They had to ask their husband's permission to go out in public. When you were having a dinner, they kind of stayed in the back, did the food, and oversaw the dinner, but they weren't supposed to come out and socialize. So women really had it bad in Athens, and actually, again, ironically, they had it better in Sparta, which was more of a, wasn't democratic at all. All right, so that ends our comparison of Athens and Sparta for their governments and their societies. If you have any questions when you're back in school, let me know.